Recording's on, huh?
Excellent. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us all for this webinar on a Wednesday evening, wherever you are. My name is Rigo Reddick. I'm the Chief of Information Systems and Security with Sanetio Cybersecurity Solutions. Sanetio is a Namibian company. We specialize in security audits, pen tests, intelligence and due diligence services, as well as cyber forensics. If you want to get your business systems tested for security compliance, find evidence of malware or misconduct on your computers, either employee or someone outside, or perhaps have us look into the background of a potential business deal or partner, associate, something big, we are at your service. You know where to reach us. Over the next 45 minutes approximately, we'll be discussing a variety of interesting points around the topic of background checks and, in that regard, personal data protection. I will now hand over to my colleague, Andrew Fordred. Andrew Fordred comes from the criminal forensics background, which he developed while at the South African Police. Before he then went into the private intelligence domain, where he spent many years specializing in open source intelligence and cyber forensics. Over to you, Andy.
Thank you, Rigo. Welcome, everybody. It's great to be here. We've had a bit of a break from webinars for a little while, but we're back in full force. And Rigo will tell you about our next webinar on the 8th of March as well. All right, just to kickstart the subject, I'm going to delve into it a little bit, and then we'll take it from there. Can you see that?
Excellent, yes.
Okay, awesome. All right, so background checks, what are we looking at when we talk about a background check? A background check is a process applied to verify that an individual is who they claim to be. And this provides an opportunity to check and confirm the validity of information provided by an individual in a particular scenario, which can be pre-employment, can be whatever the case may be. Most commonly in pre-employment. And then due diligence, which is a similar process, is an investigation or audit or review performed to confirm the facts of a particular matter that is under consideration. So due diligence broadly is mainly used in the commercial sector on companies and organizations, but I also see people use the term a lot in terms of doing a due diligence on an individual. So it also seems to apply there. It differs a little bit. Well, I think the close cousin to due diligence is intelligence. So, and then there's various disciplines of intelligence, which we're not going to go into this evening. So what do we collect in these processes? We're talking about a background investigation or a due diligence. We look at personal information or personal profile of an individual, either in applying or being an applicant in a particular situation, but it can also be a personal profile of a director or a shareholder of a particular business or a member of an organization. We can also collect information about organizations, albeit companies, nonprofits, anything to that effect, donor organizations, and various other organizations. We can also collect information about threats, but these threats can be bifocal. In other words, it's either the threat to our subject that we're doing the background investigation about or the due diligence about, or conversely, the threat could be the focus of our data collection or information collection process, and we happen to come across personal profiles or organizational information. And similarly with events. Most common when it comes to events is when you have a large event, such as a music show or a festival, and there's a couple of 100,000 people going to be attending. One does information collection around that event to see that everything is done correctly, that there's an ambulance in place in case somebody is sick, that there's fire personnel in place in case there's a fire, there's ushers in place, etc., etc. So that's what we would collect information about in the sense of events. But the key factor when it comes to most of these things, and this is where we're going to drop away from threats and events, that's a subject for another day. We're going to just focus in on the personal information and companies. When do we need consent? Some people tell you how long's a piece of string, or ask you how long's a piece of string, or how long can we stretch this elastic band? And people do. They do try and stretch the elastic band. They try to, in certain conditions, circumvent the requirement for consent. Okay, so it can be the operational environment. What operational environment are we in where we don't possibly need consent? The one is, it could be investigating a business. So you wouldn't need consent in that sense, because company data, a lot of it, or company information to a large extent, is public information. So we wouldn't always require consent in that situation. However, country legislation could require us to have consent on a particular issue, mainly regarding individuals, mainly consisting of personal information. But there are countries, for example, that for property information, many countries' property information is public information, but there are countries that have legislation that you need consent to go and research property information. Then it's the type of instruction. What are we being asked to do to collect information that we might not need consent? And one of those environments may be tracing. Skip tracing, as they call it in America. So you've got a debtor on the run or a litigant on the run, and you need to find this person. You wouldn't always require consent. However, most databases like LexisNexis and various others will require you to substantiate why you are looking for data, and and that you're bypassing the consent system. Also, certain types of fraud investigations and corruption investigations. Again, this is where it's going to start getting a little bit complicated. What does the country legislation say versus the type of instruction? So those will come into play. The last one, which can really stretch, is ethical considerations. A lot of companies might have very, very strict ethical standards, and therefore, even though you may not have consent, it may be legal to collect information in a certain operational environment or even a certain country, but that company's ethical standards will not allow it. So that is the other area where consent may come into play and require or change the dynamics of that, requiring consent. There are various other issues relating to consent. Due to time, we can't get into all of them, but these are just the general aspects, and feel free to contribute or comment on those. When we talk about personal information or person information, we look at key identifiers that they're generally known as in the sectors. And this is the full names, date of birth, country or national identification number, or social security number, as they call it in America. Addresses is important, telephone numbers, emails, and social media. Very, very briefly, social media in certain countries comes under the consent as well. So if you're doing, say, a pre-employment investigation or background investigation, some countries, even though you can waltz off to Facebook and Twitter and whatever the case is, register yourself a fake account and start to research people. But some countries will have this legislation in place that to do that, you need consent. So that does also come into play again. So social media is not always as open. And then again, it also drifts into the ethicals. What is the ethics of that particular business that requires you to be able to do social media research? Everybody in a business environment runs to LinkedIn, tries to collect as much information there, but those parameters come into play. Then we look at person associative information. What is that? We're going that sort of deep dive angle where, the type of information we need to start collecting and to form our personal profile. Now, this can be credit and financial information. To my knowledge, most countries that you go and research financial or particularly credit information, you need consent. There's very few countries that I know of that will allow you to get hold of credit information without that consent of the individual involved. Doesn't always apply to businesses, but particularly individuals. Criminal, criminal to do now. What we're not saying we're going to go and pull the person's criminal record. We don't even know that they've got a criminal record yet, or do not know that they haven't got one. So you need the consent process clicks in, that we can go and collect information to find out if they have a criminal record. And this is where it starts to also get a little bit gray, because we may be employing or doing a pre-employment research project for an applicant who's going to work in the dispatch department, but 10 years ago, he was found guilty, for instance, for drinking and driving an offense. Yes, it's embarrassing to the individual, but if you take the parameters of the employment, it doesn't impact on the employment. The guy's going to work in dispatch, or the lady, or whoever it may be, but the fact that they have a criminal record for drinking and driving doesn't necessarily impact on the job. So again, a bit of an area. Civil litigation. Have they been involved in previous litigation? Employment. What was their previous employment? Very big area. Do they hold directorships of various businesses? And this is where, again, it drifts off course, because you now get the aspect of company information that's public, and you should be able to take Joe Soap's name and go and research it against that public information to find out how many directorships he has. Doesn't always work out that way, but that's the principle in any event. Education, a fundamental area, very strictly controlled in many, many countries around the world. You have to have consent to check out educational information. Property information, again, doesn't always require consent, can be collected and retrieved for research purposes. Personal references, in other words, character references. Professional verification, the person says he's a doctor. Can you approach that particular country's medical institution to confirm that he is a doctor? Political affiliations. Is this guy politically involved in any sort of political party, activity, or whatever the process may be? They talk about PEP, for example, politically exposed person. Now, PEP data, apart from being expensive, is not necessarily non-public information. It just costs quite a lot of money to gain access to it. Reputational information. This is not always information behind databases. This can be fairly open information that can be collected, for example, from media sources. And then sanction lists. Sanction lists are public. If you know where to go and look for them, you can find them. The UN is one of them. The state's Financial Asset Control Bureau has them, and various other, and most companies have gazettes containing sanction lists. So if your name is on one of those sanction lists, that is unfortunate. Then we get to company information. What do we generally look at? We look at company name, and most importantly, operational name. Some companies don't always use their real name that they're registered as their operational name. That can vary, not often, but it happens. Legal form, are they a LCC as in America? Are they a public liability company? Are they a sole proprietor, etc., etc.? So legal forms will be important in that regard. And we want to know that type of information, particularly when it comes to debts or litigation somewhere down the road. Date of incorporation may be important from a historical point of view. Registration number, why do we want to know registration number? Because that tells us the company is legally registered. Tax number, tax information, more from a, not tax information on how much tax they pay every year. It's more from a point of view that they're up to date and that type of thing. Their address, what addresses are there for the business? Contact information, branch offices, and reputation. Not too complicated as far as that goes. That's fairly mundane, benign information that one can obtain from public sources. But then it really goes deep. When we start getting into the real business analysis side of it, and we're doing a true due diligence investigation for say a joint venture or whatever the case may be, we're now going to get the guys that really start pushing numbers or pushing various processes. The first one will be financial. There'll be a due diligence right through the financial information. Key directors and managers, there's that personal aspect again that comes into play. We're dealing with personal data again. Production, their production activity, are they up to speed, are they behind, etc. Sensitive trade arrangements, do they have some sort of bargaining power with the supplier? Joint ventures, who are their clients? Client information can be public, a bit can be public, none can be public. So it's an area of bit of grayness there as well. Personnel, who are their personnel? LinkedIn could assist in that regard. So we can get around trying to find out that type of information. And then their operating environment. So a mine that mines gold in a very hostile environment, we need to know that. Or fills up milk bottles in the forests of Germany, which is a fairly calm and collective environment as far as I know, according to Rigo. So the key issues here, what we're trying to aim at this evening is, where does this data protection lie? We as an agency, we can do due diligence or intelligence collection on a company or individuals or both. We collect all this data, we now take it, we package it, and we go and hand it over to a client. Effectively, we've released ourselves from the process, in a sense. That's up for debate. But who protects that data? Is it us? Is it our client? Is it both? It's a question that we need to answer. Where is the data protection? If it's for internal use, you're a department within a company, you're busy with a project, you need to go and collect information, you get all the necessary consents, and you're now good to go, and you can then collect this information, you give it to your manager, your superiors, the shareholders, whoever. Where's the policy? Where's the compliance in the sense of protecting that data? It comes down to, from there, into responsibility. Who's the custodian? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, if we have a breach, we have a leak, who gets held liable? This is the key thing. So going through this, my introduction this evening, in the sense of dealing with these different aspects of information, is, at the end of the day, when we have this parcel of information, who looks after that? Who's going to protect it? And as we say, as we know, Robert Miller said, there are those companies that have been hacked, and there are those companies that will be hacked. So that's the area of data protection when it comes to this. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Andy, for that. If anyone has any questions so far, feel free to bring them in now once we go over to the discussion phase with Kai Klein-Günther. Kai Klein-Günther is our legal expert. He has an LLB focusing on information and communication technology law, and deals with a lot of compliance management, especially focusing on data protection policies and good corporate governance. Kai, welcome to join us.
Good evening, Rigo. Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen quickly. So all right, can everybody see my screen?
Excellent.
All right. Open. Well, first and foremost, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us tonight. And thank you to Rigo and Andrew for this amazing talk. I think it is one of these talks that, like Andrew mentioned, is a very difficult talk or difficult webinar or topic to discuss, because there are still a lot of gray areas, loopholes in certain legislation, especially in Namibia. But I'll be focusing tonight on the general aspects of law in terms of background checks and data collection. And like Andrew mentioned, I'll be focusing quite a bit on the consent factor, which is important in this discussion. But in order for us to kick off this presentation, I'm first going to look at the Constitution of Namibia. So all of us know that the Constitution is the supreme law of the country, which protects the rights of all the citizens living in the specific country, and here in Namibia as well. There are countries that have similar constitutions. For example, South Africa or the rest of the world, they have different constitutions on all of them, but most do have constitutions in place. In Namibia, for example, the right to privacy is protected or is guarded under the Constitution under Article 13. And what Article 13 discusses is the right to have somebody's privacy protected. This includes the privacy of your home, your correspondence, and or communication. We all need to understand that these are all fundamental rights. And these fundamental rights are all limited. So every single right in the Constitution can be limited by through limitation clauses. And in the Namibian Constitution, this is found under Article 22, which is the limitation upon fundamental rights. Now, why am I touching on this basis is because in background checks, every individual has the privacy, or has the right to have his privacy protected, but there are certain aspects when this right can be limited. In order for the company to do background checks, to look at what Andrew touched on, criminal records, on different type of aspects that you're going to hire and why you're going to hire the person. And I think this is important for us to understand that, and I'll get to that later on in my presentation when I look at the consequences and risks of certain background checks or not doing the right, following the right procedure with background checks. Having looked at the Constitution, we come into the privacy matter in common law. The mere reason why I have to look at common law is that there's a lack or there's a non-existence of data protection laws here in Namibia. And this only allows us to look at common law principles and not touch on data protection laws, including things like GDPR or POPI compliance or POPI Personal Information Act. Now, they are not applicable to us at this current stage because we are not part of the European Union and we're also not part of South Africa, but some parts may at some stage become relevant. And I'm going to touch on that because GDPR, if you start collecting information of a European citizen, you might have to look at that law. But at this stage, it is not common to us, so we do not need to look at the aspects of GDPR in that sense. So in common law, privacy may be infringed. And it is infringed when somebody ascertains information about you or the person without his or her will. So that is very important because when we look at consent, you need to have that will of the individual who allows us to access that information. Now, if we don't have that access to information or we don't have access to that certain information, we'd obviously be infringing certain rights pertain to the Constitution. Now, if we look at, there are two ways in which privacy can be infringed in terms of the literal law. The first one being where a person or an outsider learns about the fact. This is often referred to as intrusion or acquaintance. So in a due diligence or in a background check, if that process is not followed, you might be targeting the risk or you'd be at risk of intruding on that personal information of the individual. Then secondly, when an outsider acquaints a third party with personal facts, which although known to the outsider, nonetheless remain private. So what do I do? What do I mean with that? It is when, hypothetically, if my current employer is friends with my possible future employer, now they speak to one another, they share information. Now my name might come up in the topic, and they share this information saying, listen, have you heard about this or have you heard about that? This is what has happened here. This is what has happened there. And this is when we share that information without legal consent of the individual. And this is where we start infringing upon certain constitutional matters. But like I said, they are limited and they can be limited in certain aspects. Having looked at the two ways in which privacy can be infringed, like I mentioned earlier, we do not have a data protection law in Namibia currently. So the only way that an individual may be protected is under delictual law. And this used to be part of South Africa as well, or it is still part of South African law. However, they promulgated the POPI, or the Protection of Personal Information Act, and with that, this act takes part precedence over how to regulate and how to conduct or process, collect personal information, and how to process that information in a background check. The same goes with GDPR, General Data Protection Regulations. They obviously, that's the law takes precedent to protection. However, here in Namibia, we do not have any data protection laws, so we solely focus on common law. And what we often do is we look at it something called a reasonable persons test. So what do I mean with that is whenever a reasonable person test is employed, we look at what a reasonable person in the institution or in the industry would have done if he was faced with a similar situation. Now, hypothetically saying again that I take my information and I share it with an employer, and I don't consent to that, the employer goes and shares my information, he has not fulfilled the reasonable person test, because if he were in the same situation, he might not have done, or he would have also not have wanted his data to be shared freely and openly without having consented to it. Now, having looked at the privacy and common law, I'm going to look at consent. And thank you, Andy. You quite frankly broadened the concept quite a bit for me as well. So first and foremost, what is consent? So consent can be defined as the free and lawful expression of will. So if I freely consent to somebody doing a background check on me, I freely give them the opportunity without duress or force or any type of external factor. I obviously grant you the access to look at and run a background check on me. And this is important when we do background checks. There must be this type of consent between the party that is being, well, the party that is doing the background check and the party that is explored or exposed to that background check. So there must be some sort of consent. Consent can be given either expressly or tacitly. So expressly means that you can do it in a form of an agreement, a piece of paper, a part in your employment contract or possible employment contract. And tacitly basically means that you would be showing a thumbs up or giving a handshake and saying, look, you're allowed to do that background check on me. The mere reason when we do background checks, we also need to have the consent of the individual national person, and he must be partly aware of some of the knowledge that is going to be done. So this has also to do with protection or personal information, the processing of personal information. Certain information needs to be given to the individual to fully understand why he or she is consenting to a certain aspect. And like Andrew mentioned, there's ways of doing or collecting certain information that can be classified, and the POPI and GDPR really expand on what personal information may be and what can be collected, and how that information should also in the background check be protected. And this is also important for the individual that is on whom the background check is done, for him to understand the possible harm that he may be exposed to, or that may later lead to exposure. So having looked at what consent is, we're going to look at what processing of information means. So when processing personal information, once again, consent must be indicated somewhere, be it, like I said, on the employment contract, an agreement, or any other type of document. And the natural person must be able to consent to the processing of personal information. And like I mentioned, he must be fully informed, and there must be an explanation why that background check is being run. So when conducting background checks, the human resource manager or possible labor practitioner or agency must receive irrevocable consent from the data subject. This is in order to protect them, and I'm going to touch on that just now in my last slide, to protect them from any type of risk that may ensue on litigation. So if that irrevocable consent is not there, that the background check might fail, and you may end up being sued for infringements of constitutional rights. And that is why that when you do the background check employ companies like Synetti to mitigate the risk. And then individual must obviously consent to the background check taking place. This can take place by the agency or by the possible future employer who says, I need to run a background check. Would you be able to please consent? And then we can discuss how we're going to allow you to, or what information we can collect and the reason for that collection. And with that, I just want to touch on the consequences or the risks. Now, conducting a background check without the consent may well taint your reputation. That means if you don't consent, if the data subject does not consent to that information being collected or being run as a background check, you may well end up in tainting your own reputation. This can obviously have quite a bad repercussion on your financials, on your company overall, like I said, reputation in the market. And once again, I come back to the risk of infringing the right to privacy of the natural person, which means that you might or may possibly end up in litigation, and that can cost you quite a bit as well. Looking at what risk transfer is, or what I mean with that is, the minute that one runs a background check, the possible future employer takes the risk away from the natural person, and this is then transferred to the company. So the risk that could possibly end up here is that you may, for example, view a possible wrong person. It can happen. You might, like I said, possibly infringe upon the rights of privacy, or there might be the risk of bias, meaning that should you do a background check that is not conducted properly, you may well end up having a different picture about the person. And yes, I understand doing a background check is important, but sometimes, like Andy said, you may touch on information that the individual might have done 10 years ago, like for example, with the being caught drinking and driving, and he's now working in the dispatch, or not dispatch, but in sales department, for example, or somewhere. So that information may well taunt your image about that person. And I think that's the reason why running background checks with third-party individuals outside of the organization is more important. But also remember that if you allow this third party to run information, there's always this risk, or to run a background check, there's always that risk of data being lost on their side as well. So ultimately, and it is a bit of a difficult one, but ultimately the consent of that data, who takes consent if a data breach takes place, is fairly difficult to define at this stage due to the fact that there is no data protection, whereas in other countries, the data protection law specifically highlights who takes consent and who takes the responsibility for what. So thank you very much. And it was a quick and brief short discussion. If there's any questions, please feel free to ask them.
Thank you very much for that, Kai. It's a good overview. And I think with that, I want to start off the questions by going back to one of Andy's last points. If you want to bring that up, Andy, while I ask it. Who actually owns the data that was collected as part of a background check? Is it belonging to the individual it was collected about, or the company it was collected for? Or does the responsibility to protect that data lie with everyone along the chain that looked at, collected, or transmitted it to other individuals? Kai, would you want to give some input on that first of all?
Yes, thank you very much, Rigo. So touching on that basis, when you're running a background check, first and foremost, the third party would obviously look at the information, but that information will still be form part of the natural person. Now we can't allow him to take the risk for that if information is lost. So hypothetically, if there was data law in place, the third party doing the background check, collecting that information, would have to take responsibility. As we currently don't have any data protection orders, it's a very gray area to give you a correct yes or no answer as to who would take responsibility. So it is very difficult to give you a correct answer on that, or a solid answer in that perspective.
Yeah, that's currently the situation we're in. Andy, I can tell you looking to answer something.
Yeah, it still, it produces that dilemma. I'm aware of certain people or certain companies that don't do background checks for arguments purposes. They just, as long as the CV makes sense, they might pick up the phone to a previous employee and that's the end of the road. Um, and they just employ a person, and then 3 months, 4 months down the road, it goes all wrong. So it's a very, very double-edged sword. And I'm raising that a little bit to add another curvature to this whole thing, that it's really problematic. I know Kai has spoken about it, and he speaks to us about it at length. When we talk about GDPR, that's fine, that's cool. But come a little bit south towards the South Pole, and things change quite dramatically.
Very true. Very, very true. That's why at this current stage there is only this common law principle that we can employ should there be some type of infringement. And then, like I'd say, that you would have to look at the reasonable person test too. How would you test the reasonable person, or how would you employ that reasonable person test? So yes, it is fairly difficult, especially in Namibia, to give you a correct, straightforward answer as to who protects the data, who collects, and who ultimately takes responsibility for data breach. And yes, that's why I'm advocating for that data protection law.
So another question, for those companies who don't do background checks, that just hire them sight unseen almost, with the sort of statement that you don't want to do background checks on everyone and one can't really do it for everyone, what would be good indicators or types of employees and roles where one should absolutely consider doing background checks?
Oh, definitely executive C-suite level. Anybody that's involved in financial aspects. I know some, I won't name them, but chain stores, if we can call it that, anybody that works and operates a cash register or has any responsibility for cash, it happens there too. I think stock is also an important area. Procurement's a huge area for background checks, and it's just made me think of something I know of, and I've worked for one of these corporates before, where procurement people go through A, lifestyle audits, and B, from time to time, some of them is every 6 months, some of them is once a year, and further background checking. Because procurement in large companies is a very, very sensitive position due to corruption and bribery and kickbacks and that type of activity. I always used to give people lectures on, you sure you can give a bottle of whiskey to the procurement manager, but just don't take it there wrapped in a fridge. So, one has always got to be aware of those type of things. So definitely those are the key sensitive areas. And then for government is another kettle of fish, but I suppose most governments have their own rules and regulations to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just to add on that, sorry, Rigo, just to add on that, Andrew, I think also when it looks something to be too true, then you should do a background check. I was faced with one of the situations where a certain individual had really misrepresented certain information, and that is on his CV, and it looked way too good to be true. So when it looks too good to be true, rather do that background check. Make sure that information or that information on the CV is really true and honest. People, and especially in these today with the economic difficulties, people tend to go and put certain information. I wouldn't want to say falsify, but put certain information on the curriculum CVs and stating that I have certain degrees or diplomas which are not there. So yes, I would also say when it looks too good to be true, rather do that background check.
Yeah.
But then also consent to it.
And a sort of quick shorthand check to add to that. When you get someone with a certain qualification or specific degree area that they specialize on their CV, and it comes into question, it seems dubious, take the time to just look up the Wikipedia article for that type of area that they focus on. Find some of the obscure subsections and ask them about it. They should be able to give a fairly quick answer without hesitating too much. And there will be a lot of ums and ahs and odd stutters if they're not familiar with the topic as they go back and forth. You can also just compare it to what's actually out there, sort of just some trivia fact checking. That's a very quick way to eliminate oddities.
I enjoy Melanie. I'm enjoying Melanie's comment.
A loophole. Social media stalking.
But you know, next week and Rigo will mention this in a bit more detail. We're going to deal with quite a sensitive topic about sort of GBV, gender-based violence and that type of thing, which is strictly speaking not a cyber talk, but it'll be an interesting one nonetheless. But and not to say too much either, there are people around the world that do background checks on any future intimate partner for that very good reason, to find out if they have a violent or a drug abuse problem or any of that sort. So that's another aspect to this all, and I'm not too sure in the consent side of some of those arrangements.
I actually wanted to bring in another question for either of you. Some companies do regular alcohol drug intoxication checks. Do you think it would be applicable for certain job roles to do regular background checks to see if the situation has changed?
Guy, you want to go?
Yeah, sure. I think there are certain. Obviously, this will always also fall back on the policy, or internal policy of the company, whether they're allowed to do it or not. Look, the Labor Act allows you to do alcohol and drug testing and to do a background check, and that I would almost say it is important for certain jobs. I mean, hypothetically saying a doctor is hired who's got an alcohol problem, it can lead you into a delictual matter, because if you, for example, lie on the hospital table and you're operated upon, and a certain individual might be intoxicated, he might cause more damage than telling the truth. So yes, I do believe that certain job positions would have to require certain checks as well. But once again, it is a very gray area. So certain information should be used, but then I also look at the aspect of bias. Not that one becomes biased to employ somebody just because they might have had an alcohol-related incident in the past. So once again, one would have to take a very neutral approach to this, and that's what I would say to the question, or that's how I would answer the question. Let me say.
I know airlines have a very strict policy to that. It's written into the contracts as well of pilots and crew that they will be subjected to random alcohol tests. I
do also know after that incident in Germany where one of the pilots had committed suicide, they enforced regular, I think it was, I'm talking a correction here, 6 or 8 months tests on or psychological analysis or psychological tests. So yes, you can do it because we're looking at it becomes a Bonnie Morris principle. So the safety or security of the country is more important, or the individuals flying the airline. So yes, certain jobs would have to look at and we're allowed to look at certain background checks if it is important for the public interest. So we can skip that and say, listen, this is important for the public interest. I mean, you need to consider the public as well in certain aspects. So yes. Yeah, absolutely. Definitely.
Yeah, as a lot of fields have got psychological psych evaluations as regular tests, and they very much roll over towards general background checks in a large degree. But before Andy, you're going to say something?
Yeah, just on, I just want to take 10 steps back. Not so much the guy with the drinking and driving case. You do a pre-employment examination, and I know I'm drifting slightly off topic here, but and please, audience, feel free to chip in as well. It's not strictly the data. Well, I suppose it is in a way. It is in a sense data protection. So somebody changes work after a long period of time, and he was convicted of fraud, say check fraud or whatever the case may be, and he's never committed fraud again. And then you get that background check, and it goes into that inquiry. I know some countries, or maybe company policies, they say after 10 years, if there's been no reoccurrence of a particular issue, it falls away. It'll be interesting to know. I mean, and Kai, chip in if you want. Is there a limitation? I don't think so in terms of legal principles, but is there a limitation that background information is still relevant to a particular process such as job applications?
Do you want to go ahead on that? Otherwise, I will.
Let me just wrap my head quickly, and then I'll get back to that and just chip in. So if you have an answer there.
So from my perspective and what I've seen with some businesses, especially businesses that there's certain businesses that specialize in hiring ex-convicts, rehabilitating them. Yes. It's very much up to the level of risk acceptance that a business is able and willing to deal with. And that very much varies based on the role they're hiring for. So if it's, say, a chef, someone who works on things that don't really impact things large financially, and the guy doesn't have a predilection for poisoning things, then he's probably fine for working in a kitchen. Car dealership, if he's a window washer, he's a bricklayer, a welder, all those kinds of general work areas where you're not directly interacting with financial information, you're not dealing with a lot of customer data. There I would say it's pretty much okay to hire someone that's previously been convicted of, say, check fraud or financial related crimes, as it's unlikely to really affect that line of work he's applying for. There's a question for Melanie.
Yeah,
I'll let you go, Kai.
Sorry, I just want to quickly pitch in there as well. I also think it, like you mentioned now, it will depend on the job application or the position for which you are hiring. For example, if you were to hire somebody who worked in finances and was convicted of fraud, then certain background checks should be run. But like I mentioned again, one should be careful not to step into the trap of bias where one convicts immediately. Surely it has happened, and it's happened a lot of times. It's also when a director is removed from his position as directorship due to, for example, mismanagement of a company. There are certain aspects of the Companies Act that would take years for him to be subsequently allowed to be subsequently hired as a director again. So there are certain aspects that one would have to consider. So it all depends. It will depend on, like Rigo mentioned now, if companies do hire ex-convicts, because if he can prove that he's been rehabilitated and he's allowed back into society, I could probably give him a chance to prove himself. But somebody who worked in fraud and stole, let's say, money 15 or 20 years ago, and I find that information, should I allow him back into to work with a monetary or money if he's had a conviction? It's a gray area, but I do believe one should not immediately take that bias and take that step and say, okay, I'm going to not hire you because of that aspect. And that's why it is important to do those background checks with consent. And if somebody doesn't have anything to hide, they'll probably tell you the truth and say, listen, I might have, but people also feel that they might be neglected in that sense to be hired. So yeah, it's a gray area as well.
Yeah. So the question from Melanie, what I would like to know, does someone has to have a kind of reputation to qualify for getting the background information, or can anyone get this information? I think, Andy, this is something that you want to answer.
I presume reputation means position to obtain.
That would be Yeah,
so your professional position, or the short answer is anybody can get this information. You can cut through everything. It wouldn't make it legal though. But the long answer is, if your position requires you to get this information, you get consent, yes, you can get this information. A lot of the information is public. So it's really, when it goes into, I mean, even civil litigation is strictly speaking, is not non-public information. It's public information. So if you know somebody was involved in a court case in a particular area, you can access that data. Criminal records, no, you need consent to get hold of those, particularly if it goes through a whole process, depending on from country to country. So yeah, it really depends what you're doing.
Okay, is there some more questions, some more suggestions, things you like, things you didn't like, something that's on your mind you'd like to ask pertaining to the topic or tangential to the topic perhaps? You can raise your hand if you want to go on the microphone directly or post it in chat. In the meantime, let me get my screen sharing working here.
Rigo's up to something again. This is the bonus part of these webinars.
Is it? I just wanted to introduce the next webinar.
Ah, okay, cool. That's a good idea. I'm going to pause the camera.